It is no exaggeration to say that George S. Patton remains one of the most recognizable American generals of World War II. A household name more than 7 decades after his final command. His fame stands alongside Eisenhower and MacArthur, commanders whose victories shaped the modern world. Patton led armies through North Africa, Sicily, France, and deep into Germany, his Third Army racing eastward in a campaign that helped bring Nazi Germany to its knees. Honored by Allied nations, immortalized in film and literature, his legend seemed destined to endure forever. But many don't know that his final weeks were marked not by celebration, but by suspicion, controversy, and a death so sudden it defied medical explanation. On December 21, 1945, just 12 days after a minor car accident, Patton died in a German hospital under circumstances that have haunted researchers ever since. The official cause? Heart failure from a blood clot. The unanswered question: why did a man showing signs of recovery suddenly collapse and die within an hour, just as plans were being made to fly him home? Was it truly a medical complication? Or was George S. Patton silenced? By late 1945, the general who had once been an indispensable asset had become something far more dangerous: a political liability. His outspoken warnings about the Soviet Union, his reckless criticism of occupation policy, his refusal to moderate his language even as Washington grew increasingly alarmed. All of it made him a problem that powerful figures in both America and Moscow could no longer ignore. Patton was a brilliant but uncontrollable man who never hesitated to speak his mind, regardless of consequences. And in the emerging Cold War, a conflict fought in shadows, hospital corridors, and intelligence files. Speaking your mind could be fatal. By the winter of 1945, former allies were becoming enemies. Intelligence agencies were repositioning across occupied Europe. Assassination methods were already in use, quiet, untraceable, designed to look like natural causes. Hospitals, with their limited security and constant flow of personnel, were vulnerable environments. And Patton, immobilized and isolated, was more exposed than he had ever been on any battlefield. What followed in those final days remains one of history's most disturbing mysteries. A car crash that injured only one passenger, a recovery that seemed to be progressing, and a sudden death that came at the most inconvenient possible moment. For Patton, no autopsy was ordered, no toxicology tests were performed. Key documents later disappeared from archives. Witnesses contradicted one another. The official explanation was accepted without challenge. But decades later, former intelligence operatives would come forward with allegations that stunned historians. That Soviet agents had infiltrated occupied Germany. That poison capable of mimicking natural death was already in use. And that Patton, outspoken, symbolic, and impossible to control, may have been deliberately removed before he could cause further disruption. This is not a story of tanks and battlefields. It is a story of power, silence, and the price of speaking truth in a world that had already begun its descent into Cold War paranoia. It is the story of what may have happened when America's most famous general became too dangerous to keep alive. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. To understand why Patton might have been targeted, we must first understand how dramatically his role had changed after Germany's surrender, and how his transformation from war hero to political threat made him a target unlike any he had faced in combat. When Nazi Germany collapsed in May 1945, Patton lost more than an enemy. He lost his purpose. The battlefield general who had thrived on action and momentum suddenly found himself governing occupied territory, a role that demanded diplomacy, restraint, and political sensitivity. Patton possessed none of these qualities. Worse, he had no interest in developing them. Almost immediately, he began criticizing Allied occupation policy. He openly opposed denazification efforts, arguing that punishing ordinary Germans was counterproductive, and that many former Nazi Party members were needed to rebuild infrastructure. These were not quiet, private concerns. Patton voiced them in press conferences, interviews, and official meetings, statements that infuriated Washington and sparked outrage across the Allied command. But it was his warnings about the Soviet Union that made him truly dangerous. Patton believed the Red Army posed an immediate threat to Europe. He advocated for confronting Stalin before Soviet forces consolidated their control over Eastern Europe. In private conversations and increasingly public remarks, he suggested that the wrong enemy had been defeated, and that the next war was already beginning. "We promised the Europeans freedom," Patton reportedly said. "It would be worse than dishonorable not to see they have it." These were not the words of a diplomat. They were the words of a man who saw himself as a prophet and who refused to be silenced. Washington was listening. So was Moscow. And both were growing increasingly alarmed. By the autumn of 1945, the wartime alliance that had defeated Hitler was collapsing with astonishing speed. Former partners were becoming adversaries. Intelligence agencies that had coordinated against Nazi Germany were now turning their resources toward each other. Across occupied Europe, operatives were repositioning, embedding themselves in displaced person camps, government offices, and medical facilities. A new kind of warfare was emerging. One fought not with tanks and artillery, but with surveillance, infiltration, and elimination. The Soviet Union had already perfected methods that would define Cold War espionage for decades to come. Their intelligence services specialized in operations designed to leave no trace. Silent killings that appeared natural, accidents that seemed plausible, sudden illnesses that doctors would accept without question. Poison was a preferred weapon. Soviet chemists had developed compounds that could mimic heart attacks, strokes, and pulmonary embolisms, the exact complications that might be expected in a patient recovering from serious trauma. These substances were fast-acting, difficult to detect without specific testing, and nearly impossible to prove in autopsy unless investigators knew precisely what to look for. Hospitals were ideal environments for such operations. Security was minimal compared to military installations. Personnel rotated constantly. Visitors came and went. A person dressed as medical staff could move through corridors unquestioned, particularly in the chaos of post-war Germany where displaced workers and temporary hires filled countless positions. And Patton, immobilized, isolated, and under observation only by rotating nurses and occasional visitors, would have been extraordinarily vulnerable. More than that, he would have been symbolically invaluable. Silencing America's most vocal anti-Soviet general would send an unmistakable message. No one, regardless of rank or fame, was untouchable. On the morning of December 9, 1945, General George S. Patton set out on what should have been an unremarkable day. He had arranged a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany, a brief respite from the tedium of occupation duties. The weather was cold but clear. His driver, a skilled and experienced man, navigated the familiar roads in Patton's staff car, a 1938 Cadillac limousine. Riding with Patton was his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, and Patton's dog. At approximately 11:45 a.m., a U.S. Army truck made a sudden left turn directly into the path of Patton's vehicle. The collision was minor. Both vehicles were traveling at low speed. The impact caused minimal damage to either the truck or the Cadillac. The truck driver walked away, unharmed. Major General Gay suffered only minor bruises. The dog was fine. Only Ton was catastrophically injured. He suffered a severe fracture and dislocation of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, a devastating neck injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He was conscious, but unable to move. What happened next raised questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. No formal investigation was conducted into the circumstances of the crash. The truck driver, whose sudden turn had caused the collision, was never charged with any offense. Within days, he was quietly transferred out of Germany altogether, removed from any possibility of follow-up questioning. The accident report, if one was ever completed in full, has never been located in military archives. For a collision involving one of America's most famous generals, the lack of scrutiny was remarkable, and for some, deeply suspicious. Patton was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where military doctors immediately assessed the severity of his injuries. The prognosis was grim, but not necessarily fatal. His spinal cord had been compressed, but not severed. He was alert, lucid, and able to speak. Specialists were brought in from across the European theater. His wife, Beatrice, was notified and began the journey from the United States to be at his bedside. The hospital itself was a sprawling facility treating hundreds of patients in the chaotic aftermath of war. Nurses, orderlies, doctors, and support staff rotated through shifts. Displaced persons worked in various capacities throughout the building. Security, while present, was minimal. Certainly not what one might expect for a figure of Patton's prominence. High-ranking visitors came and went. Military officials, intelligence officers, former colleagues. Each visit required access to Patton's room. Each visitor passed through corridors monitored only sporadically, if at all. Across occupied Germany, intelligence operations were intensifying. Soviet agents had successfully infiltrated American and British zones, often posing as refugees, laborers, or administrative personnel. Hospitals, overwhelmed and understaffed, were particularly vulnerable to such infiltration. The 130th Station Hospital was no exception. For Patton, immobilized and dependent on constant care, the hospital represented both hope and extraordinary vulnerability. He could not move. He could not defend himself. He relied entirely on those around him, doctors, nurses, attendants, many of whom were strangers cycling through shifts in a facility managing thousands of personnel. It was a place of recovery. But it was also, for anyone with the means and motive, a place of opportunity. Then, against expectations, something remarkable happened. Patton began to improve. In the days following the accident, doctors observed signs of neurological recovery. He regained slight movement in his hands, a critical indicator that the spinal cord damage might not be permanent. His breathing strengthened. His vital signs stabilized. The initial despair gave way to cautious optimism. Medical staff began discussing the possibility of transporting him back to the United States for advanced treatment. Plans were drawn up. A specially equipped aircraft was prepared. If the progress continued, Patton might not only survive, he might eventually regain significant function. For his family and supporters, this was cause for hope. For others, it was a nightmare scenario. A recovering Patton would return to American soil as a living martyr, vindicated by survival, emboldened by controversy, and angrier than ever about Soviet expansion and Allied policy. He would have a platform, he would have an audience, and he would be utterly impossible to silence through conventional means. His survival would complicate diplomatic relations with Moscow at a moment when the Truman administration was attempting to navigate an increasingly hostile post-war landscape. It would embolden critics of denazification. It would reignite debates about military leadership and occupation strategy. Patton, alive and speaking, was a variable no one in power wanted to manage. Patton recovering was worse. And so, as December progressed and Patton's condition appeared to stabilize, the stakes shifted dramatically. What had been a tragedy was becoming a crisis. And crises, in the world of intelligence operations, demand solutions. On the evening of December 21st, 1945, George S. Patton was in stable condition. He had spent the day alert and conversational. His wife, Beatrice, sat at his bedside as she had for days, reading to him and discussing plans for his transport home. Medical staff noted nothing unusual in his vital signs. There was no indication of imminent crisis. Around dinner time, Beatrice left the room briefly to eat. She expected to return within the hour to continue their conversation. She never spoke to her husband again. In her absence, Patton suddenly began struggling to breathe. His condition deteriorated with shocking speed. Nurses rushed in. Doctors were summoned. Within minutes, despite frantic efforts to stabilize him, George M. S. Patton was dead. The official cause of death was listed as acute heart failure secondary to pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had traveled to his lungs. It was described as a tragic but medically understandable complication, following severe trauma and prolonged immobilization. No autopsy was ordered. No toxicology screening was performed. No investigation was launched into the circumstances of his sudden collapse. The death of one of America's most famous generals, a man whose survival had been anticipated just hours earlier, was accepted as natural without question or examination. His body was prepared for burial. Within days, he was interred in Luxembourg among the soldiers of his beloved Third Army. The matter, officially, was closed. But the questions, those would endure far longer than the answers ever could. For decades, Patton's death remained what it appeared to be, a tragic medical complication following a car accident. Then, long after the key figures had died and Cold War secrets began to surface, former intelligence operatives started coming forward with disturbing claims. According to these sources, Soviet intelligence had successfully embedded operatives throughout occupied Germany by late 1945, posing as displaced civilians, medical personnel, and administrative workers. Their mission was surveillance, infiltration, and when necessary, elimination of high-value targets. The allegation was specific and chilling. Patton had not died from natural causes. He had been poisoned. The substance allegedly used was designed precisely for situations like this, a compound that could induce respiratory failure and cardiac arrest while mimicking the symptoms of pulmonary embolism. When administered to a patient already suffering from trauma and immobilization, it would be virtually indistinguishable from expected complications. Soviet intelligence services were known to possess such poisons. Declassified documents from later decades revealed extensive research into undetectable toxins that could simulate natural death. These weren't theoretical weapons. They were operational tools used in targeted assassinations throughout the Cold War. The method would have been straightforward. A brief window of access, an injection or ingestion masked as routine medical care, and rapid onset timed to a moment when the victim was alone or under minimal observation. Without an autopsy, and specifically without toxicology screening, proof would be impossible, and no autopsy had been performed. The theory remains unproven, but the circumstances that would have made it possible, the means, the motive, the opportunity, and the convenient absence of investigation, were all undeniably present. The search for definitive answers has been frustrated at every turn. Key documents related to Patton's accident have disappeared from military archives. The official crash report cannot be located. The staff car he rode in was later discovered to have been significantly altered before being placed on public display. Modifications that make forensic analysis of the original collision impossible. Witness accounts contradict one another. Some individuals present at the hospital were never formally interviewed. Others who spoke initially later refused further comment or recanted portions of their statements. The truck driver who caused the accident was never located for follow-up questioning after his transfer from Germany. What is known is this: Patton died suddenly after showing signs of recovery. No autopsy was performed. No investigation examined the possibility of foul play. And the politicals, climate of late 1945 provided both motive and means for his elimination. What is suspected, but cannot be proven, is that powerful forces may have decided Patton's survival was unacceptable. History demands evidence. Assassination allegations require proof. Neither has emerged in a form sufficient to close the case definitively. But history also demands context. And the context tells us that the world Patton died in was already operating by Cold War rules. Ruthless, secretive, and willing to sacrifice individuals for strategic advantage. Intelligence agencies were active. Poisons existed. Hospitals were vulnerable. And Patton had become inconvenient. Whether he died from complications or conspiracy may never be conclusively determined. But he died at the exact moment when his voice had become dangerous. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on maps. They're fought in silence. And sometimes history's greatest mysteries aren't solved. They're buried.